mic is on. Excellent. Got to make sure the mic is on. Okay, so good afternoon. This is an unusual time for me to be doing this, but that's okay. We had some things going on at Redeemer on Sunday that made it just not a great time to be doing this, and so I just wanted to postpone it till today. So here we are. Monday afternoon, beautiful day in Austin, Texas. And of course, as always, every day is a beautiful day to talk about the Gospels. So that's what we'll be doing today. I have entitled today's episode Synoptic Problems because we will be talking about the Synoptic Problem. But first, before we get into that, I want to just go back over some stuff that we did last time. We talked about genre. The question of what genre are the Gospels? How should we understand the Gospels as pieces of literature? What are they? And we talked about how genre is important for a few different reasons, among which are the fact that genre can help set expectations for the reader. Readers will have certain expectations of a book, a film, a TV show, depending on what genre it is. Second, genre can indicate how the author intends to be understood. So, we can kind of tell a few different things in terms of the author's intention based on the genre that they are writing in. An author writing in a more sort of mystery genre, we might be able to draw some conclusions about their intent based on that genre versus a biography, just to give kind of a simple example. And then third, genre locates a text within a certain literary culture. So if we have information about different generic expectations and habits of a particular time period, then we might be able to draw some conclusions about a particular text. And I used a bunch of different examples, mostly from film and television, to illustrate some of these things, but just to kind of bring up a few of those items. For example, if you have a laugh track in a television show, that indicates certain things to us about the genre of that television show. And that kind of leads us to expect certain things to appear or happen in that TV show and not others. There's a particular tone that we would expect. We would not expect a television show with a laugh track to suddenly diverge into the realm of drama or something like that. If you want to go back and look at some of those examples to refresh your memory, feel free to do so. I'm not going to recount all of those here. But we discussed a few different options for the genre of the Gospels. One pervasive theory was that the Gospels are sort of their own special genre. They don't really belong to any particular genre, but they're sort of this unique form of Christian literature. Basically, to hear some folks like C.H. Dodd describe it, this is basically a sort of story format of early Christian preaching combined with Old Testament theology. And we said that the Gospels are indeed unique. There is nothing quite like them in ancient literature, but there are enough concrete similarities between the Gospels and other forms of ancient Greek and Roman literature that we can't really say that they're entirely unique. They are not sort of their own genre in that way. We also discussed the possibility that the Gospels belong to the genre of some kind of Jewish literature. And, this is a simplification because, of course, Jewish literature, there's a lot of different forms. In particular, though, we discussed the claim that the Gospels are similar to Jewish narrative from the Second Temple era, or even sharing some similarities with narrative from the Hebrew Bible. And while there is definitely an intertextual relationship between the Gospels and Jewish literature in this vein, the almost exclusive focus on Jesus himself, the extent to which the Gospels describe his life, there isn't really a solid parallel in the realm of sort of Jewish biographical literature. And so we sort of landed on this notion that the Gospels are a subset of Greco Roman biography. There are enough similarities between the Gospels and their account of the life of Jesus and other examples of Greek and Roman biographies from the Hellenistic age that it seems appropriate to describe the Gospels as belonging to this category of Greco-Roman biography. Of course, there's a lot of different sort of varieties of Greco-Roman biography, but since it's a large category, the Gospels can kind of fit into it without too much effort or kind of stretching of the evidence. And this is, I would say, a relatively accepted notion that the Gospels are a type of Greco-Roman biography. The extent to which we sort of identify them with various aspects of Greco-Roman biography is kind of another question. Some folks, I think, would sort of see more similarity, others less, but that's sort of another question. But at least this idea that the Gospels are a form of Greco-Roman biography is, I would say, relatively uncontroversial. And so, what did we say about the sort of value of this? Well, when we're reading, having some sort of awareness of these sort of genre level ideas can help us. It helps us set expectations. If genre is something that authors can use to communicate expectations, if we have some sort of idea of sort of the generic constraints or expectations that ancient readers would have been expected to have, then that kind of helps us know how to approach the text. Gives us some clues as to how we should understand the material that we are presented with. But at the same time, there's also this other level at which the Gospels, as a collection, sort of have their own genre. And this is where I'm somewhat sympathetic to the idea that the Gospels have their own unique genre, because in practice, this is somewhat true. We receive the Gospels as this collection of books by and for the church, and there are sort of, I would say, generic expectations associated with that idea. We do have some sort of generic expectations of a gospel that we don't necessarily have of the letters of Paul, for example, or different parts of the Hebrew Bible. And, when we read from the gospel texts, we don't say this is the Greco-Roman biography of the Lord. No, we say this is the gospel of the Lord. And so there is sort of this other layer of almost ecclesiastical genre, churchly genre, that does impact how we read. And that's okay. It is appropriate that if we are reading as Christian readers, that we sort of accept the Gospels, receive the Gospels in a Christian way. And so both of these things can be held together, I think. So, moving on to our discussion for today. So, given that, and I'm thinking back to our discussion of Christian remembering and preservation of the words and deeds of Jesus, given that the early Christians intentionally remembered and preserved the words of Jesus, and through the processes of social memory and tradition, produced texts, the Gospels, that are generically Greco Roman biography, we now come to what has sort of become known as the Synoptic Problem. And so, my goal today is to, in a sort of general way, describe the literary relationships among the Synoptic Gospels. And I'll get to what those are in just a second. And then hopefully address at least a couple errors and potential misunderstandings when it comes to the Synoptic Problem, mostly in relation to sort of apologetics and some ideas related to that. Now, I will admit, there's a lot to unpack when it comes to the Synoptic Problem. And we don't have time to go through all of it. This is intended to be a 12-week series. We are now about halfway through. And so there's a ton of really technical stuff rolled up in this idea of the Synoptic Problem that is not really worth getting into in a setting like this. And I think very highly technical discussions of the Synoptic Problem are not necessarily helpful for folks who are not involved in kind of the academic aspects of the Synoptic Problem. Having said that, I think it is helpful to have some general understanding of the issues involved and to have some awareness of those things, even if we aren't sort of trying to get down to brass tacks, as it were. So my intention is not to present you with clean solutions, but rather to expose you to questions, if that makes sense. If you're not familiar, this is John Mulaney, one of my favorite stand-up comedians. So we're not going to be trying to unpack all of the Synoptic Problem. So what is the Synoptic Problem? This is one of the sort of most long-standing discussions in modern New Testament studies. And, by modern, I mean sort of the last 250 years. I am not an expert on the Synoptic Problem. I do most of my work in the realm of narrative criticism and rhetorical criticism, where I am primarily dealing with sort of the version of the Gospels that we have in our Bibles, what's sometimes called the final form of the text. And so some of these things that play into the Synoptic Problem have to do with sort of the redactional history, or kind of how the Gospels were composed and how they were edited together, things of that nature. So I'm just not a complete expert on some of this stuff. But if you listen to today's talk, and if you're interested in finding out more or kind of hearing some more of the technical details, I would recommend heading over to the YouTube channel for the New Testament Review podcast. And Ian Mills, who's one of the co-hosts of that podcast, has a couple of really good presentations on that YouTube channel that deal with the Synoptic Problem. One of them deals directly with the idea of Markan priority, and the other deals more generally with the Synoptic Problem. He has a lot of great examples and different things, and I think explains it really well. So, if you want more detail than I am going to give you today, check those out. I will maybe post links to some of those things in the description of this video later on, so they're easier to find. But Ian has some great stuff So if you're interested, go check him out. He is a PhD candidate in New Testament at Duke University. So what do we mean by synoptic? This is a word that has Greek roots, basically just means seeing together. So that is in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we have basically 3 texts that describe the same stuff. The events of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are essentially the same set of events. John details different events. There are stories in John that don't show up in the other Gospels. John kind of has his own thing going on. And so today I am addressing the Synoptic Gospels, that is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So, John kind of has other stuff going on, orients his gospel in a different way. But all that to say, there is a lot of shared material among Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And there's a few different ways to refer to this stuff. You have what's called the triple tradition, which is stories and material that are shared by all 3. So Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And then you also have what's called the double tradition, which is material that is shared by Matthew and Luke, but not Mark. And so you have these various kind of sets of stories and sayings and sections of teaching and things like that that are shared by some gospels, but not others. And interestingly, almost the entirety of Mark is reproduced in Matthew, about 90% of it, and about half of Mark is reproduced in Luke. So you have Matthew and Luke both basically copying large sections of Mark, reproducing the Markan narrative in their own gospel. And so you take all of this data and you kind of wonder, like, how did we end up with these 3 texts that have so much overlap, and yet are sort of distinct? How do we explain all of these interlocking pieces in these 3 gospels? That is the synoptic problem. Figuring out where did these overlaps come from? How did these overlaps come to be? That is the synoptic problem. And I think synoptic puzzle is maybe slightly more preferable. It's not really a problem. It's more like a puzzle to be solved. How do these things fit together? So I want to start off with the point that it is incorrect to say that the synoptic gospels are literarily independent. And what I mean by that is, based on the data that we have in the synoptic gospels, based on the overlaps that we can see, based on the relationships that we can detect between these 3 texts, it is incorrect to say that they are literarily independent. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that if we think of the Gospels as 3 texts written by 3 individuals that are all working independently, that is incorrect. And this kind of gets at an example or an analogy that I hear sometimes, usually in the context of apologetics. And the analogy goes like this. It's usually intended to answer objections about the veracity or reliability of the Gospels. And the idea is, well, multiple witnesses are better than only one. And so in the Synoptic Gospels especially, you have 3 people, 3 authors, all saying the same thing. You have Matthew, Mark, and Luke all giving basically the same report. And so, the analogy goes, let's say there's a car crash and you have three witnesses on the scene and they all say basically the same story that, oh, I saw the red car hit the blue car and then drive off, right? They all have the same basic story to tell. And you would probably conclude from that, oh, well, that's probably what happened because these three witnesses all say the same thing. The problem is that the three witnesses, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, not only say the same thing, but they say the exact same thing. So, in other words, you don't have Mark saying, well, I was at the coffee shop and I walked out on the sidewalk and I saw this car hit this car. And then I ran over to help or something like that. And then Matthew says, well, I was over at the grocery store and I saw this car hit this car. And then I called an ambulance. And then Luke says, some other variant. That's not exactly what we have with the Synoptic Gospels. We have three witnesses saying basically the exact word for word thing in some instances. And so if you had three witnesses to a car crash or a crime or something else, and they all had the exact same story, in other words, if their written statements were virtually identical, that would be a little suspicious. And my point here isn't really to get at the accuracy or the reliability of the Synoptic Gospels, but simply to say that there is an assumption being made in that analogy that is incorrect. And that is that these are three independent, literarily independent witnesses. Two models that are sometimes used to sort of argue for this sort of thing are on the one hand based in oral tradition, so saying that, well, we can explain the similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke by saying that, well, they all had access to similar oral tradition. Stories about Jesus that were passed down, tradition, even the sort of tradition that we talked about 2 weeks ago, that they all had access to this stuff. And so that kind of explains why they all have the same stories. Why, the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, for example, in Matthew and Luke are so similar. Or why, the Lord's Prayer shows up in multiple places. Or there's this other theory that, and these are kind of older ideas, that there's this original Hebrew gospel of some kind, or Hebrew or Aramaic sources, and that, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have access to these, and so that explains the similarity. But this doesn't really get around the fact that there are significant verbatim similarities, word for word similarities among Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so it is impossible to escape the conclusion that when these gospels are being composed, somebody is reading somebody else. So all three of these gospel authors have some sort of source in common that goes beyond oral tradition and that goes beyond some sort of other gospel that's being translated. All three of these authors are reading one another, or they're reading some other written Greek source when they are composing their gospels. And so that's why I use the phrase literarily independent. There is a literary relationship, meaning that there is a some sort of common denominator among them, some sort of common written source that all of them are drawing on. That is sort of the inescapable conclusion when it comes to trying to explain the similarities. How do we know this? I want to show you just a few examples, starting with the idea of verbatim agreements. So I want to show you a parallel here between Matthew and Luke. So, Matthew 11, Jesus is talking, and he says, at that time Jesus declared, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and understanding and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Okay, so that's Matthew. Luke, in chapter 10, has this. This is going to sound really repetitive. In that same hour he rejoiced in the Holy Spirit and said, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and understanding and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me, etc., etc. You know, you can see that these are identical. You know, this is a very long string of verbatim agreements. The only difference between these is, you know, this little intro here. At that time, Jesus declared in Matthew, versus in that same hour he rejoiced in the Holy Spirit and said in Luke. And so this sort of verbatim agreement can't be explained by common oral tradition. This sort of exact duplication, you cannot reduce this to, oh, well, somebody, you know, was preserving the same story about Jesus, and Matthew and Luke both had access to this tradition about Jesus saying this. You can't explain this sort of verbatim agreement via oral tradition. Similarly, you can't explain this sort of verbatim agreement via some sort of translation from an Aramaic or Hebrew record either. You know, if you're translating something, there's going to be variance in your translation versus someone else's translation. Even if the general meaning's the same, there's going to be some sort of variation. And so having some sort of Aramaic source that both Matthew and Luke are using doesn't explain how they have this very long string of verbatim agreements in both their Gospels. And so we are really left with the conclusion that they must be reading the same thing. So either they are both reading some sort of Greek source that has this word for word in there, or one of them is reading the other. Those are kind of our options. Okay. So we have, you know, other examples of this as well, but a lot of verbatim agreements that really can't be explained by anything other than a shared source or direct copying one from the other. Another significant point in favor of this interconnected literary relationship is the order of the stories, the narrative progression itself. So kind of apart from verbatim agreements, you also have similar stories in a similar order. For example, the beginning of Luke, I say beginning, you know, apart from the first couple of chapters, but, you know, Luke 3 and onwards basically follows the order of Mark. So you have the same stories in the same order. You know, Luke adds detail and kind of adds some different things, but there's basically the same order. Except for Mark 6 through 8, Luke pretty much duplicates Mark's order. And as I said, there are some differences. There are some variations. You know, Luke puts his own spin on some of the stories in Mark, but the parallels are significant enough that it's very difficult to argue against the notion that Luke is using Mark as his baseline. Mark is a source for Luke. Luke is literarily dependent upon Mark. Similar thing going on in Matthew. There is a duplication of order in terms of what is happening when. And so all that to say, like, if you go back to the car crash analogy, this isn't just, three people giving the same general description of a car crash. This is duplication of very specific details that is kind of impossible to explain unless they are all working from shared material. Also very interesting is inclusion of editorial comments. So an example here, this time with Matthew and Mark. This is in this sort of apocalyptic section, and Jesus is talking, and he says, so when you see, and this is Matthew, the one on top, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, parentheses, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. So there's Matthew. So Matthew is saying, well, there's this reference to Daniel, the abomination of desolation, and the author has inserted this comment, let the reader understand, saying to the reader, there's something that you should pay attention to. If you know about Daniel, the book of Daniel, then you'll understand what's going on here. So Jesus is not saying let the reader understand. This is an editorial comment on the part of the author. Well, where does he get this editorial comment? Well, we have the same comment in Mark chapter 13, 14, and 15. Very similar statement. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, etc., etc. Almost identical. There are a couple of changes in Matthew, most notably the explicit mention of Daniel and the mention of the holy place. So Matthew seems to be actually clarifying both the source of the reference and also the place where he ought not to be, which in Mark is a little ambiguous. Matthew kind of cleans that up and communicates that it is the holy place in the temple. But other than that, virtually identical. But that editorial comment is preserved. It's still there. Which seems to indicate that either Mark is the source for that editorial comment, or in whatever source Mark is using, that editorial comment was in there and he has preserved it and transmitted it to Matthew. So you have examples like that of editorial comments that did not originate with, in this case, Matthew, but were preserved by Matthew from a source, in this case, apparently, Mark. So, all of these things suggest very strongly that there is a literary relationship, literary dependence among Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So, the question is, how do we get from those early Christian traditions about Jesus, the social memory of Jesus, people preserving Jesus' words and deeds either in their own memories, in notebooks, as we discussed being a possibility, in church tradition, how do we get from decades of that to Mark, and then to Mark, Matthew, and Luke? And the reason why I have Mark as sort of the middle step there is this. It is basically uncontroversial in New Testament studies these days that Mark is the first gospel. It is the earliest gospel. And so, the easiest way to explain these similarities between Mark and then Matthew and Luke is to say, well, Mark was first, and Matthew and Luke are using Mark as a source. So, this is what is called Markan priority. The idea that Mark is the earliest gospel, and then the idea that Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source. This is uncontroversial. And so I am going to accept that as I do. So it is basically a given that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source. And so the question is, how do we then explain, on the one hand, material that is overlapping between Matthew and Luke, and on the other hand, material that is unique to Matthew and Luke? And there are two possible solutions to this problem that I am going to present to you today. I am not going to present all of the different arguments for these theories. I am going to just generally describe them. If you are interested, there is a ton of information out there about kind of the details of these two theories. And there are even other solutions out there. I'll briefly mention just right now. In the early church, it was thought that Matthew was the first gospel, or at least that Matthew was sort of primary among the gospels. You may ask, well, if Mark is the earliest, if Mark is first, why is Matthew the first one in our New Testaments? And that's basically why. Augustine argued for Matthew as being older, the first gospel. And there's some traditions about Matthew originally writing in Aramaic. There's a lot of discussion out there about that. But as I say, these days, Markan priority is pretty much the standard. And so I'm going to show you two theories that are based on Markan priority. Okay. First of these is the Farrer theory, sometimes called the Farrer hypothesis, named for Austin Farrer, who was a British pastor and theologian. So the idea here is that Mark functions as a source for both Matthew and Luke. And then Luke uses Matthew as a source as well. And so this explains both the material from Mark that both Matthew and Luke have, and then also it explains the presence of material from Matthew in Luke that Mark does not have. This is a simple solution. And this is sort of where I land personally. One of the strengths of this solution is that it uses the texts that we have, the Gospels that we have, to explain the phenomenon or the phenomena that we see in the Gospels. We don't have to sort of posit other hypothetical sources, and I'll get to those in just a minute. But it has that advantage of simplicity. Occam's razor, if you will. It works from the texts that we have. The one thing that the Farrer theory does not have going for it is that it's a little too clean. There's something about it that's, depending on how you view things, it might be a little too tidy. And it's sort of hard to know, uh, based on the evidence that we have, uh, whether or not that tidiness is accurate or not. Uh, Maybe you'll see what I mean in a second. But all that to say, this is one way of explaining uh, the material that we have. That Matthew and Luke both use Mark, and then Luke uses Matthew. So again, this helps us explain the material that Matthew and Luke share, and it also explains how material that Matthew has that Mark does not, how that material ends up in Luke. It's because Luke was reading Matthew. So Luke essentially becomes this sort of hybrid of material from Mark and Matthew. Now you might be wondering, okay, and this is sort of where I sort of question the simplicity of the fairer theory, and I kind of think I may be missing some elements of the fairer theory. Again, I'm not sort of an expert on this stuff, um, but there are things in Luke that that Mark and Matthew do not have. And so, how do we explain the presence of that material? Are these things that Luke has sort of pulled together? Are they original to Luke? Not in the sense that the author of Luke is making them up, but in the sense of, these are previously sort of unknown or unrecorded traditions that Luke is putting together. And I believe that would have to be the explanation from a fairer theory perspective. But we also have what's called the two, or sometimes called the four source theory. And the key assumption of this is that Luke is not aware of Matthew. So whereas with the fairer theory, you have Luke using Matthew as a source, in this theory, Luke is not aware of Matthew. And so, if Luke is not reading Matthew, then we need to be able to explain somehow the presence of material from Matthew that ends up in Luke. So, how do we do that? Well, you may have heard of this before. We do this in the 2/4 source theory by positing a theoretical source called Q. And it's called Q because Q stands for Quelle, which is a German word meaning source. So it's kind of like saying ATM machine. The Q source is the source. Or PIN number or whatever, the source. But Q is, in this sort of hypothetical construction, basically a collection of sayings, things that Jesus said that both Matthew and Luke had access to. And so this explains how things that Jesus said that appear in Matthew also end up in Luke. It's not because Luke was reading Matthew, it's because they were both reading this other source called Q. And so there's kind of this hypothetical theoretical construction that is used to explain this, to solve this problem. And so this is sort of the two source theory that you have Q and Mark functioning as sources for Matthew and Luke. Well, then you might say, well, where does the four source thing come into play? Well, further, there's kind of two other sources, M and L. M for Matthew, L for Luke. That sort of explain the presence of material outside of Mark and Q in these two Gospels. And so all of the what's called the special Lucan or special Matthean material that doesn't appear in Mark, that is attributed to these other sources that we can't identify, that we don't know about. And so these theoretical sources are used to explain the phenomena that we see in the Gospels. And so I think the real difference between these two constructions is that the fairer theory basically works, to my understanding, basically works with the text that we have, whereas the 2/4 source theory basically has to posit the existence of these other sources. Now, this is kind of where I really want to go with this. These are both perfectly reasonable theories. Okay. In terms of explaining what we actually see in the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, these are both very reasonable and plausible things to posit. And keep in mind, we are dealing with sort of models of literary relationship. Some scholarship has pushed the idea of Q into the realm of trying to kind of reconstruct Q and kind of approaching Q as this sort of concrete set of sayings, treating it like an existing document, which I think leads you to some kind of weird territory. Not all scholarship on the synoptic problem that uses Q as a theoretical framework does that. And I think some Christians really respond negatively to things like Q because, from a certain perspective, you can say, well, dealing with a theoretical Q gospel, that sounds kind of crazy. Like, why would we do that? But you have to remember that this is just a working theory for explaining things. We're not saying that there's necessarily this Q document out there somewhere. We're simply saying that this is a theoretical framework for understanding what we see in the Gospels. And so I think some Christians, when they become aware of things like fairer, they're very drawn to it because it does sort of only deal with the three synoptic gospels that we have, and we don't have to deal with having these kind of hypothetical things. And so that can have some appeal to it. But, again, these are theories, and they are both reasonable and they are both plausible. So, when I'm talking about Q and theoretical things, don't dismiss it out of hand, because they are both perfectly reasonable frameworks for explaining this. But, why am I even talking about this? Why is it important or even helpful for sort of normal Christians to know about these things? Because here's what I am not suggesting. I am not suggesting that when you are reading your gospel, when you're looking at Matthew, I don't expect, or I would not even encourage you to be thinking about things like the fairer theory or the four source theory when you are doing your Bible reading, right? Or when you're sitting in church and we're listening to the gospel lesson. Should you be thinking about, does this come from Q? Is this from the L source? Did Luke get this from Matthew? Are these things that you should be actively thinking about when you are engaging with the text? No, that's not what I'm saying. So I am not presenting these things to you as things that you should be consciously aware of as you are engaging with Scripture. My point is more to expose you to the complex nature of the gospel tradition. Okay. The synoptic gospels come from a very complex and very self-referential tradition. In the gospels, in the four gospels, not just the synoptics, We do not have four separate, independent stories. And in fact, in the three synoptic gospels, as a fairer adherent, Luke, which is actually the gospel that I primarily do research on and write about, Luke is essentially a retelling of two other gospels. That's not simple. That is self-referential. Luke is referencing, repackaging, refactoring two other gospels. And so the synoptics, they are produced by this sophisticated process. And again, thinking back to our discussion of memory, a sophisticated process of remembering, a process of traditioning, handing down stories about Jesus, material about Jesus, written records even about Jesus, a process of editing and rewriting, and a process of composition, weaving those things together into a text, into a cohesive story. And these things, I think, are important to keep in mind, to be aware of, because the synoptic gospels have very real and very legitimate differences between them. This is kind of where the apologetic question comes in, because I find that often discussions of the synoptic gospels, sort of oriented towards apologetics or oriented towards the reliability of scripture or the historical veracity of the gospels or something like that, are a lot of times oriented towards trying to explain away the differences between the synoptic gospels. Why, if Luke and Matthew are both referring to the same instance of teaching in the Sermon on the Plain and the Sermon on the Mount, why are they so different? And a lot of times, Christians attempt to explain differences away in ways that flatten out the differences between the synoptics, that ignore the very real processes of rewriting, editing, redaction, and composition that go into the production of the synoptics. And so these variations and differences can't always be cleanly and clearly reconciled. And we just need to be aware of that. And I would venture to say that if your conception of scriptural inerrancy or infallibility or what have you, if your way of thinking about those things relies upon the three synoptic gospels, and even John as well, cleanly fitting together in a way that makes complete sense, in a way that doesn't generate conflicts, then there are probably some things that you're overlooking. And this is not to say that the Gospels are this mess of contradictions. That's a common tactic as well for apologists outside of Christianity, to say, well, the Gospels don't agree at all, and there's all these conflicts and things like that. And there are questions about that need to be considered and do have answers. But we want to, at the same time, be clear-eyed about the relationships between the synoptic gospels, the differences between the stories, why those differences are there, and what we should make of them. We want to hold that and also hold on to the fact that we can acknowledge those things, we can think deeply about those things, but we can also be confident in the veracity of the Gospels. These things are not in tension. We may have to think about them. We may have to ask some questions. We may be confused about them sometimes, but these things are not ultimately, they do not negate each other. just because Matthew and Luke are different does not mean that they are in conflict, and it does not mean that they are not that they lose their veracity. I hope that makes sense. And so that's why I say that my goal today was primarily to expose questions and not necessarily to provide clean answers. And, this is why I think studying the Synoptic Gospels in particular is so fascinating, because each Gospel author is recounting similar events, but oftentimes putting different theological spins on the stories, different rhetorical emphases that provide a lot of value to us as readers. And so we don't want to throw all those things away by trying to flatten out the synoptics, by trying to make them all agree. We want to let Mark be Mark. We want to let Matthew be Matthew. We want to let Luke be Luke. And we want to acknowledge that even though these are distinct authors, there are these relationships between them. But we can be aware of all those things and not lose the veracity of the Gospels. So I hope that all makes sense. Like I said, I am not an expert on the synoptic problem, so if some of these things have piqued your interest, I would check out Ian Mills' videos, see what he has to say. If you have any questions about this stuff, I'd be more than happy to accept those and try to address them next week. Speaking of next week, we are going to, I think, begin talking about specific gospels. And I haven't decided yet if we're going to start with Mark or Matthew. There's kind of, which one do you start with? The oldest one? Do you go with Mark in priority, the first gospel, or do you go with the first gospel according to the early church? Which, if you go with Augustine and others, that would be Matthew. So I haven't decided which it's going to be, but we will be discussing and kind of doing an overview of that gospel's sort of theological profile. What are some distinctives of that gospel? What are some things that will be helpful to us as readers when we are engaging with that gospel? So we're going to go through each of the four and kind of do that with each one. So we'll be starting that process next week. Eventually, we're also going to talk about sort of non-canonical gospel literature. So after we've sort of thought about the canonical gospels, what do we do with these other texts that are classified as gospels in early Christianity, but they're outside the canon? So what do we do with gospel literature that are not among the four gospels? So that'll be coming up in the coming weeks. Having said all that, I am going to stop there. So I will see y'all next week. Send me your questions if you have any. And until then, peace be with you.